In this video, we're going to cover an introduction to gymnosperms, and then there will be some additional videos that go into more details. We talked a little bit about the plant evolution timeline in a different video, so here we're going to focus on the gymnosperms, which first became apparent in the evolutionary timeline about 400 million years ago. And this picture here is actually a picture of this fossil that is known as a seed fern. And it's the earliest known seed plant in evolutionary history. Now, it's possible that there were plants or seed plants that evolved before this, but remember that not all structures are able to be fossilized. So this is the best evidence we have in the fossil record that tells us when these seeded plants, these seeded vascular plants, started to show up in the fossils. Gymnosperms started to become more prevalent when the environment on Earth became drier. And we'll talk a little bit more about the different kind of structures of these seeded vascular plants that help them to basically have an evolutionary advantage during drier periods. About 240 million years ago is the most diverse era for gymnosperms. So there was kind of this explosion of adaptations and mutations that resulted in this wide variety of gymnosperms becoming kind of the prominent plant life on Earth. One adaptation that allowed gymnosperms to kind of evolve and survive and become more successful is the development of seeds. And seeds have a couple of different structures associated with them that provide different functions that help with the survival of gymnosperms. So first of all, seeds store energy, and that helps to nourish the developing embryo. And an embryo is basically a developing baby plant. The seed is also surrounded by a protective seed coat, which is made out of tough material. And this material helps to prevent the seed and the embryo from desiccation, which is just drying out or dehydration. And abrasion, which is physical or mechanical damage. The tough seed coat also allows for long periods of dormancy. So dormancy basically means that the seed is still there and existing, but it's not really metabolically active and it's not continuing to develop. So it just kind of stays in this kind of dormant state until the conditions in the environment are right for it to germinate. And this dormancy can last for tens to thousands of years. And so this is one way that, if a seeded plant produces a seed and the conditions aren't right, the seed can hopefully, potentially wait it out until the conditions become optimal for it to germinate and grow into its own plants. This is different from seedless plants, which have to germinate right away. They don't have the ability to stay dormant for long periods of time. So overall, seeds help to increase gene dispersal through space and time. With space, this is just due to seeds being able to be carried to different parts of the environment. And so these seeds, some of them can float, some can be carried on the air or in the air by wind. Others might hitch a ride on an animal's fur. Some seeds actually hitch a ride in an animal's digestive tract. When an animal comes along and eats a fruit or a seed, and that seed passes through the digestive tract, and then it gets deposited somewhere when the animal defecates. And oftentimes the feces of the animal actually helps to provide some fertilizer for the germination of the seed. And then the gene dispersal through time has to do with those long dormancy periods. Pollen is another evolutionary adaptation that helped seed plants to become more successful over time. So pollen is the male gametophyte, and it contains haploid or 1N sperm. And these sperm are the gametes, so these are the male sex cells associated with plants. Pollen forms a protective coat around the sperm to protect it from desiccation. Once again, that just means drying out or dehydration, and also mechanical damage, which can be known as abrasion. And pollen has the ability to travel far away from the sporophyte, and a lot of pollen is transported in the air. Some of it is transported on water, it can stick to animals. There are lots of different ways that pollen can get dispersed. Here in South Carolina, you're probably familiar with the kind of the yellow pine pollen that is all released in the springtime, and you can actually see a haze in the air from that pollen, and then it covers your car and the roads and your house, and it makes you sneeze. That's all pollen. So those are all the male gametophytes associated with gymnosperms, which pines are a type of gymnosperm. And this ability to travel far from the sporophyte, once again, allows for a greater range to spread genes. So the genetic information carried in the sperm can be kind of dispersed further away to then fuse with other gametes and kind of create new genetic combinations. Some additional general information about gymnosperms are that they are the dominant plant type in coniferous biomes and the taiga. They can also be found at high altitudes. Gymnosperms are adapted to survive in cold, dry environments. Some of the adaptations include that they are often evergreens. So a lot of gymnosperms are evergreens, as you can see in this picture over here. And an evergreen is a plant that keeps its leaves year-round. So it's a tree that keeps its leaves year-round. And in this case, the leaves are usually a needle-like leaf. For example, a pine needle. And one benefit to being an evergreen is that these plants can actually continue to do some photosynthesis in winter. So even though there is less direct sunlight hitting the planet in wintertime, they still have leaves that have chlorophyll that can do some photosynthesis in order to provide the trees with nutrients. Because they keep their leaves year-round, they're also ready for increased photosynthesis in the spring when the days become longer and there's more sunlight. Most of the pollination in gymnosperms happens via wind or insects. And as a reminder, they are vascular plants, so they do have the xylem and phloem vessels going through the tree. The word gymnosperm actually means naked seeds, and so these are seeds that are not enclosed in an ovary. These seeds are somewhat protected by modified leaves called sporophylls. And these sporophylls are arranged in a structure known as a strobylus. And plural would be strobili. And this is just the scientific name for a cone. So pine cones, like you see in this picture here, these are the strobili, which are those modified sporophylls that contain the seeds. On the previous slide, we introduced the concept of these strobili, or these cones. And these cones are the gametophyte generation of these plants. Now there are male and female cones. The female cones are larger and they're known as ovulate cones. And the male cones are smaller and they're known as pollen cones. A gymnosperm may be monoecious or dioecious. Mono means one. And so monoecious means one home or bisexual. And what happens is that the male and female sporangia, and the sporangia are just those cones that we talked about, are going to be on the same plant. Now we still have male and female cones, so this plant still has ovulate cones and pollen cones, but those cones are coexisting on the same plant. So the one in monoecious has to do with them being on the same plant. So one plant has both types of cones. Dioecious, di means two, and in a type of plant that is dioecious, it means that the male and female sporangia, or those cones, develop on separate plants. So there are essentially male plants and female plants. Gymnosperms exhibit the alternation of generations in their life cycle. The more dominant or more noticeable generation is the sporophyte generation, which consists of a multicellular organism, and the cells are diploid. So you can see that in this pine tree here. So the pine tree that you're seeing is the sporophyte generation, and the tree is made up of many, many cells, and each of those cells is diploid. And remember, diploid just means that each cell has two sets of chromosomes. The gametophytes are going to be those cones or those strobili that we talked about on the previous couple of slides. And these gametophytes contain haploid cells. So they're still multicellular, but the cells are haploid, which means that they only have one set of chromosomes in them. And so in order for these gametophytes to occur, meiosis needs to happen. Because meiosis takes that diploid condition and converts it into a haploid condition. And if you're familiar with pine trees, you know that these cones are typically attached to the tree. So these cones are reliant on the sporophyte for survival. Now the cones might eventually fall off the tree, but they're no longer living at that point, and they might fall off and then release their seeds or their pollen as they kind of die and dry out. So let's take a quick look at the classification of gymnosperms. Remember, here we're talking about taxonomy. And remember that taxonomy, we start with these kind of broader categories, and then we come narrower or more specific as we go through the classification scheme. So the broadest classification is the domain, and gymnosperms are in domain Eukarya. Remember, we've learned about two other domains already this semester. We've learned about domain Bacteria and domain Archaea. And then Eukarya is the next one. Plants are in the supergroup Archaeplastida, and this includes plants, but it also includes some protists, specifically the red and green algae. Plants are then classified in kingdom Plantae, and this should have an E on the end of it, so I apologize for the spelling error. And other kingdoms include kingdom Fungi, kingdom Protista, and kingdom Animalia. And then within the Plantae kingdom, there are four phyla representing the gymnosperms. There's phylum Coniferophyta, which are the conifers, phylum Cycadophyta, which are the cycads, Ginkgophyta, which are the ginkgophytes, and Cnidophyta, which are the cnidophytes. And we'll talk about each one of these in more detail in a different video.